Today, we're in the Inyo National Forest and headed up to the highest point in the Golden State.
Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we are in beautiful, sunny California and headed up to the top of the state. But before we start this adventure, take a moment and click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates.
Mount Whitney is part of the Sierra Crest on the border between Inyo and Tulare counties, bound between the Central Valley of California and the Great Basin. The Sierra Nevada, in turn, are part of the much larger and longer American Cordillera, a long series of mountain ranges that stretches along the western edges of the North and South American continents.
There's three major ranges in the United States: the Appalachian, the Rockies, and here, the Sierra Nevada. This range is pretty much the youngest of the three, with uplift continuing to this very day. It stretches about 400 miles in length from the north to the south, mainly through California, though there is a part in Nevada. This range has played a key role throughout California's history. How these peaks came to be is an intriguing and complex story.
The oldest rocks in the Sierra Nevada are of an ancient oceanic sedimentary nature, dating back 450 million years. The main part of the story, though, begins about 220 million years ago, as the Farallon Plate, an ancient tectonic plate, started to subduct under the North American Plate. This caused the creation of a volcanic chain running through this area, and also resulted in the creation of batholiths, massive granite structures formed deep underground.
Over millions of years, the volcanoes disappeared as the Farallon Plate was subducted under the North American Plate, and the Pacific Plate emerged as well. Those massive granite batholiths, though, they still remained underground. Another uplift began about 10 million years ago, and this time, those blocks of granite were literally pushed up into the mountains that we see today.
This gargantuan fault block has made the slopes of the eastern side of the mountains much steeper than the western sides. It's particularly noticeable in the Sierra Escarpment, in the southeastern portion of the range, where you can take in the 7,000 feet of elevation change. Even today, the uplift continues, the effects which can be felt in the earthquakes that often occur here.
The next part occurred during the Ice Age. While the massive continental ice sheets never covered this area, they definitely affected it. The high elevation here saw glaciers form and retreat numerous times. The water, wind, and glacial erosion stripped away any of the softer rock, leaving behind the light-colored, highly resistant granite that makes up these mountains and cliffs today.
The geology of these mountains is sketched out in the stones and the physical geography of the area. Time and the dynamic environment have created some incredible natural treasures, such as the Devil's Postpile, one of the finest examples of columnar basalt in the world, Lake Tahoe, the largest alpine lake in the United States, Yosemite Falls, the tallest waterfall in California, and Ribbon Falls, the tallest single-drop waterfall in North America. These are just a few of the many amazing sights you'll find in this range.
On a side note, the formation of the Sierra Nevada is also related to the formation of Death Valley. Badwater Basin there is 282 feet below sea level, and it's the lowest point in the continental United States. It's only 85 miles in distance between the top of Mount Whitney and that low point.
It's not just the geology of the Sierra Nevada that make it such an incredible place, but also the biology of the range as well. The uplift that created these mountains also made possible an environment that has 5 different life zones.
Part of this is due to the height of these peaks. The Sierra Nevada causes what is known as orographic lift. In other words, when an air mass is forced from a lower elevation to a higher one. It's one of the main reasons why the western side of these mountains receives as much precipitation as they do.
On the eastern side, you get a rain shadow effect, contributing to the desert conditions of the Owens Valley, stretching eastwards into Nevada. As you explore through the range, take note of the changing environs. On the higher reaches towards the summit, keep your eyes peeled for Skye Pilot, a beautiful wildflower endemic to these mountains. And then, there are the trees, most notably the giant sequoia. If you have the time, make sure to visit Sequoia National Park to see these incredible giants, including General Sherman, the largest tree in the world.
There is a long history of human activity here in the Sierra Nevada. People have been living, hunting, trading in these mountains for thousands of years. Some of the oldest archaeological evidence found dates back to 11,000 BCE.
One of the first known cultures was the Martis people, who lived on both sides of the range from around 3000 BCE to 500 in the current era. Archaeological evidence found from their time shows a people who hunted with basalt-tipped spears and ground foodstuffs using the hard granite rocks.
The Martis people seemed to disappear after 500 current era. Whether they were assimilated by other tribes, wiped out by intertribal conflict, or they just moved away due to changing environmental conditions, we don't know. You can still find evidence, though, in the northern Sierra of their time here, in the form of petroglyphs and carvings that they left.
At the time the Europeans arrived, there were a wide variety of tribes living throughout California, but the tribes near the Sierra Nevada had little interaction with the newly arrived foreigners, and some would have no contact with them until the 19th century.
When the Americans started to arrive en masse, many of the native tribes in California were affected. Two in the Sierra Nevada that were heavily affected were the Maidu, living on the western side of the mountains, and the others were the Owens Valley Paiute, living here on the eastern side. The Maidu unfortunately found themselves living right smack in the middle of what would become the gold fields, and they were quickly pushed out.
The other, the Owens Valley Paiute, called the mountain Tumengaya, meaning old man. They believed the peak was the home of the Great Spirit who watched over their people.
Native American tribes by the mid-19th century were absolutely devastated by the gold rush. They saw their entire cultures upended. They faced starvation. They faced plagues with diseases like measles, pneumonia, diphtheria that they had zero immunity to. Today, these events have become known as the California Genocide.
Prior to 1849, approximately 150,000 Native Americans lived in California. By 1870, only 30,000 remained. Entire communities were wiped out by starvation, disease, and conflict. Despite being admitted as a free state, California passed legislation legalizing enslavement of Native peoples, destroying families and cultures.
Native tribes living in the Sierra faced the brunt of the genocide. Land and resources that they'd relied on for generations quickly disappeared. Facing destruction, some turned to drastic measures like killing cattle and raiding mining camps. Retaliation, though, by the U.S. Army and white settlers was often swift and brutal.
Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, white settlers continued to seize the best land and water sources, Open conflicts were frequent. By the 1870s, many of the remaining native populations were forced onto military reservations, often in abysmal and poor conditions. It is a tragic chapter in California's history that is only now being recognized for what it was. The first European to set eyes on California was the Spanish conquistador Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo in 1542. Cabrillo had set sail with instructions to head northwards along the coast and discover the Strait of Annan, a northwest passage rumored to exist. Cabrillo made landfall here in San Diego and then continued to sail northwards above the Channel Islands, but it was a difficult voyage. Cabrillo himself died in 1543 on San Miguel Island, and his expedition was viewed as a failure.
Despite Cabrillo's discoveries, Spanish interest in colonizing California was muted at best. Frankly, this place was just too far and remote. Getting here required a ton of effort. If you're coming across land, first you go through the desert and you'd have to travel through native territory. If by sea, you gotta get around the Straits of Magellan and then fight the southerly currents coming from the Pacific Northwest. Any colonization effort here would require significant economic capital. And frankly, Spain was not inclined to make the investment.
It'd be another 200 years before this attitude changed. In 1768, word reached the Spanish court that the Russian Tsar was sending a naval expedition to explore Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. With threat of a competitor, Spain was spurred into action.
Even now that they had intent to colonize, Spanish efforts pretty much were limited just to the coast through the use of Franciscan missions. The first one was built in 1769, in what is now modern-day San Diego.
Spain established 21 missions along the California coast as far north as San Francisco. While colonial efforts were limited, Spanish explorers did venture into the interior.
In April 1776, Pedro Font, a Spanish soldier, headed inland from San Francisco Bay. As he trekked eastward, eventually spotted a high range of mountains rise up before him. He mapped them as una gran Sierra Nevada. In other words, a big snowy mountain range. We know them as the Sierra Nevada.
When Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, they also gained control of California. They started to grant large chunks of land out to cattle ranchers, and a nascent leather industry began to take shape. Even with more settlers receiving land grants, the mountains still remained untouched.
The Sierra Nevada form an imposing wall. Their sawtooth profile, high elevation, the possibilities of inclement weather make them a challenge to get through. When native tribes lived here, they passed through this range on a regular basis. But the first recorded instance was by an American, frontiersman Jedediah Smith.
Born in New York, Smith came west as a young man and joined the Rocky Mountain Fur Company as part of Ashley's 100. Smith quickly gained a reputation for bravery and hardiness, fighting in a desperate native raid and surviving a brutal grizzly attack.
In 1826, the area where Jedediah Smith and his men had been trapping beavers had basically run out of pelts. In order to find a new source, they opted to journey to the southwest, first to Utah, then Nevada, and upon reaching California, they were detained by Mexican authorities under the impression that Smith and his fellow trappers were American spies.
After several weeks, Smith was released and ordered to leave the way he came. He and his men did follow their route back, at least until they were beyond Mexican settlements. At that point, he turned north and trekked up the Central Valley until encountering the western side of the Sierra Nevada. Along the way, he and his men were busy trapping beaver with the intent of making that year's rendezvous.
Their first attempt to cross through the Sierra was thwarted due to snow, but the second, at Ebbets Pass, would prove successful. Smith and the two men still traveling with him then had to make the long, treacherous trek across the Great Basin. Despite the hardships, Jedediah Smith arrived at the rendezvous on time and was greeted with a cannon salute.
Jedediah Smith may have been the first American to cross the Sierra Nevada, but American influence was already being felt in Alta California even before his journey. Due to the remoteness, Spanish and later Mexican authorities were more lax with restrictions, readily trading with English, Russian, and American ships.
After Mexico achieved independence, they took over California as well. The new government opted to shift away from the mission system that had been prevalent under Spanish rule and instead began to develop large cattle ranches and a leather industry. But Mexico was confronted with the same problems the Spanish Empire had. California was just too distant and difficult to reach.
Over the next few decades, more foreigners started to trickle into the area, to include Americans. Of particular note was a German-Swiss businessman named Johann August Sutter, who, upon receiving a major land grant of 48,000 acres, established a fort, orchards, vineyards, fields, and pastures at the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers in 1839.
Sutter's land grant would soon become the prime location for one of the most significant events in California's history. But more on that in a little bit. By 1846, what we now know as the state of California had a population of about 100,000 Native Americans and 14,000 people from other areas, whether from Spain, Mexico, or further abroad. Of that latter group, 2,000 of them were Americans, and more were arriving every day. In 1845, James K. Polk was elected the 11th President of the United States. He was voted in on a pro-expansion platform. The United States was interested in territory in the West, controlled both by Mexico and Great Britain. California was a top priority. Tensions between the two countries had been simmering for the past decade regarding Texas and its border with Mexico. Mixed in with this was the American concept of manifest destiny, that the United States had a divine right to expand coast to coast into a continental empire, something that wasn't possible while Mexico owned a good chunk of that territory. Instead of de-escalating tensions between the two countries, Polk and his administration worked to ratchet them up. On May 13, 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. And while most of the conflict would take place in Mexico itself, California would become its own theater of operations. Well, at least eventually. It took 3 months for word of the declaration of war to actually reach here. But once it did, the Americans were swift to act. The conquest of California may have been brief, but it was significant. Hostilities commenced in the latter half of 1846, with several battles and sieges occurring over the next few months. By the middle of 1847, the Americans forced the Californios to sign the Treaty of Cahuenga, bringing things to a close. With the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded a vast chunk of territory north of the Rio Grande to the United States. With the recent addition of the Oregon Territory, the U.S. now stretched coast to coast from the Atlantic to the shores of California on the Pacific. The country also had a new national high point. We just didn't know it yet. And while California was a recent addition to the cast, it was about to stand front and center on the national stage. One of the seminal moments in Californian history took place on January 24th, 1848, when James Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill. The news of this discovery
took off like wildfire. Before long, word of gold was in every paper of the country.
Once word was out, the floodgates opened. Prior to the gold rush, California was just a sleepy part of the frontier. But with gold fever now on everybody's minds, it was the place to be. Over the next 7 years, 300,000 people, both from the US and abroad, flocked to California.
Of those people heading to California, a good share of them arrived overland following the California Trail. Splitting off the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall in Idaho, the California Trail traveled across the Great Basin and through the Sierra Nevada at Carson Pass, eventually arriving at the gold fields on the western foothills of the mountains.
The trail was not easy by any stretch. First, you'd have to cross through the water-poor Great Basin, and then you'd have to make it through the Sierra Nevada. Both daunting prospects. Eventually, other side routes would open up, but none of them made the trail any easier. When the Transcontinental Railroad finally opened, over 200,000 people had traveled via the California Trail to California.
The gold rush brought significant and rapid change to California. A burgeoning population and economic power fueled by mineral wealth allowed it to skip being a territory and go right to statehood. California was brought into the Union with the Compromise of 1850. On September 9th, 1850, it became the 31st state. With gold rush fever running hot, California gained a population, an economy, and a high crime rate almost overnight. To manage all this, California quickly drafted a constitution and declared their own extensive borders. Unlike, say, the Mormons and its proposed state of Desiree, California was able to get away with this, which begs the question, how?
Every so often you hear it said that if California were its own economy in the world, it would be like the 5th largest. Surprisingly, this is not a new idea. The same concept was very much on the minds of Congress in the mid-19th century. To paraphrase what was stated on the floor, at the time California was further away from Washington, D.C. than England was.
There was a very real concern that California could declare itself its own nation. It had the natural resources, the people, ports, and the isolation to do so if it so desired. It had even dabbled with the idea briefly with the Bear Republic, a symbol Californians continue to carry on their state flag to this day.
Nothing reflects this position of power more than California's eastern border. Now, we've looked at this border in some depth before on how it was surveyed when discussing Nevada's Highpoint. But for this time, it's worth exploring just why the border was put there in the first place.
Congress had intended to divide this territory into multiple states, but now found itself in a position with little recourse but to say yes to California's proposed measures. California, on the other hand, was in a position to skip right over territorial status, petition directly for statehood, with the lines they had drawn. California's eastern border was put where it was because it could be. It gave California total control over the gold-rich Sierra Nevada. And nobody on a federal level was in any position to tell them no. Since California was never a territory, Congress had zero say in its borders. Several years later, Congress did send a proposal to alter the border to the crest of the Sierra Nevada. This would have placed the border over the top of Mount Whitney and made it a shared state high point with Nevada. For this to happen, though, California would have to agree to it. And as you can probably already guess, they did not. Even with a booming population and the intensive search for gold, Sierra Nevada here remained a veritable unknown. To remedy this, the California legislature created the Office of State Geologist in 1860. They named Josiah Whitney to the position and tasked him with conducting a comprehensive survey of California. Josiah Whitney was one of the foremost economic geologists of his day and opted to take a comprehensive approach to this task. He organized a multidisciplinary team of some of the best scientists to include a young Clarence King. The survey Whitney and his team set out to conduct was going to be in-depth, not just focused on geology, but other fields of study like paleontology, botany, and zoology. Interestingly enough, though, the California legislature, they only really cared about mineral wealth. And things would come to a head when the survey finally published its first 2 volumes, not on economic geology, but paleontology. Needless to say, the legislature was not thrilled. Over the next several years, the survey continued to execute its mission, but the state legislature started cutting the budget for it. It was completely defunded by 1874. Despite the loss of funds, Whitney continued working through the data collected and published volumes in 1879 and 1880. Starting in 1863, the California Geological Survey would spend a great deal of time out here in the Sierra Nevada. They were the first to identify most of the flora in the mountains. They also trekked through Yosemite Valley and eventually produced a guidebook for it, which would prove to be quite popular. In 1864, they began a concerted effort to explore the High Sierra and document and map their findings. It was during this excursion that Mount Whitney was discovered. The survey named the peak after Josiah Whitney, and Clarence King set out to make the first recorded climb. Unfortunately, he came up short on this occasion. King came back again several years later. This time, though, he mistakenly climbed nearby Mount Langley. When this was pointed out, Clarence King came back to California yet again. But before he could reach the top of Mount Whitney, he was beaten to the punch. The first recorded ascent of the mountain was on August 18, 1873, when 3 fishermen from nearby Owens Valley summited the mountain. They wanted to name the mountain Fisherman's Peak in recognition of their successful ascent. Despite the push by local citizens, the original name of Mount Whitney stuck. In September of 1873, Carl Rabb climbed to the top of Mount Whitney with an atmospheric barometer to measure the elevation of the peak. Based on his calculations, it had an elevation of 14,898 feet, which later measurements would reduce down by several hundred feet. Despite that, it did establish Mount Whitney as a new national high point. As for Clarence King, he too would finally make it to the top of Mount Whitney later that very month, on the 19th of September. Despite the survey having been shut down, its findings in the Sierra Nevada proved fuel for other scientific endeavors. Mount Whitney in particular was an appealing draw due to its elevation and clear skies. In September 1881, Samuel Pierpont Langley led an expedition up the peak in order to study solar radiation. Further scientific efforts followed, both astronomical and meteorological. All this activity led to the first development of a more robust trail leading to the summit. It was a combined effort with funds from both local residents and the U.S. Army. They carved a pack trail up the eastern side of the mountain, and it was completed in 1904. The second major development was a shelter on the summit in the form of the Smithsonian Institute hut. Interest in having a more permanent structure on the top of the mountain had been a long-time goal for scientific parties. By 1909, a sturdy 3-room structure had been constructed. When you do reach the summit, take a moment to check out the hut there.
While it might look rather inauspicious, it is, in its own way, an engineering marvel. All the rocks were sourced from the summit, while all the other material that was used to build it had to be hauled up. Even then, the rocks had to be shaped and placed and mortared by hand. And while the hut was built to protect folks from inclement weather, in a bit of irony, the Forest Service strongly advises that you do not seek shelter in the summit hut because its metal roof attracts lightning. John Muir arrived in California by sea, stepping off the steamer in Nebraska on March 27, 1868. Upon his arrival, he immediately set forth for Yosemite Valley. When he got there, he'd spend a month roaming through it. The place enthralled him like no other.
Only a few years after his arrival, Muir was making regular treks into the Sierra Nevada. The range captivated him, and he believed it should be renamed as the Range of Light, due to how the sun dances across the granite edifices of the peaks.
Muir trekked all through the Sierra Nevada, including reaching the top of Mount Whitney in October of 1873. The route he took, we now call the Mountaineers Route.
Muir was a tireless advocate for the preservation of the Sierra Nevada, writing about the mountains for many of the most popular magazines of the time. His descriptions of the places he explored fired the imaginations of his readers. In 1882, he and several of his friends and colleagues formed the Sierra Club with the express purpose of preserving the mountains. In 1904, John Muir met with Theodore Roosevelt in Yosemite. Roosevelt had written Muir and requested that Muir guide him through Yosemite. Muir, recognizing a golden opportunity, readily agreed. Over the course of several days, the two men had deep conversations on the preservation of the wilderness.
Theodore Roosevelt walked away from these 3 days with a renewed sense of purpose. He expanded protection of Yosemite Valley, then went on to create 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 55 national bird and wildlife refuges, and 150 national forests. Many of the public lands we enjoy today are built on that foundation.
John Muir left a lasting impact on the Sierra Nevada. In 1907, the Inyo National Forest was established, setting aside public lands in the eastern Sierra. It was eventually bordered by John Muir Wilderness, 650,000 acres, including many of the areas Muir himself explored during his lifetime. It was designated by Congress in 1964, 50 years after Muir's passing in 1914.
You can also hike the John Muir Trail. At just shy of 214 miles, it'll take you from Happy Isles in Yosemite Valley all the way to the top of Mount Whitney. It is one of the great long trails in the United States.
If you think this location is stunning, you wouldn't be alone in that assessment. A new industry at the beginning of the 20th century found these locations appealing as well. For Hollywood, this area would be the perfect backdrop for the up-and-coming movie business.
If you were a kid growing up in the mid-20th century, maybe in the Midwest or out east, and were asked to describe what the American West looked like, then your description would probably look a lot like this. And why not? Some of your biggest heroes, folks like Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, Tom Mix, they were riding through here, taming the Wild West.
The first movie recorded in the Alabama hills was The Roundup, starring Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, filmed in 1920. The film went on to be one of Arbuckle's critical successes. Soon, other features followed suit, and the Alabama hills quickly became a stand-in for the American West. It shouldn't come as a surprise that this place became popular with Hollywood. It was only a few hours away, and in the big scheme of things, easy to get to. And the weather here was ideal to work in. Picture-perfect film days were commonplace. And then, there was the scenery. You just couldn't beat it.
If you are an actor of any renown in the history of Hollywood, you probably at least made one trip out here. Superstars like John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Lucille Ball, Humphrey Bogart, those are just a tiny few of the many who walk the boards in these hills.
The nearby city of Lone Pine continues to celebrate this heritage. They have a movie room at the Lone Pine Chamber of Commerce dedicated to this history. You can also check out the annual Lone Pine Film Festival every October. Finally, in the Indian Trading Post, there is an autographed wall with many signatures of Hollywood stars.
It wasn't just westerns they filmed here, they filmed everything. War movies, comedies, adventure films, sci-fi features, superhero movies. If you needed incredible scenery or something that looked otherworldly or foreign, this was the place to go. Even today, modern filmmakers come here and shoot music videos and commercials. They shot parts of Man of Steel here. They shot parts of Iron Man here. They even shot a Western, Django Unchained.
The Sierra Nevada remain a premier destination for all lovers of the wilderness. With a size of 25 million acres, they attract 50 million visitors every year. It's a place of stunning beauty and jaw-dropping magnificence. Before you start your Whitney adventure, you need to get through a bit of red tape first. Due to the popularity of this peak in the summer season, there is an annual lottery for permits. More information can be found on the Inyo National Forest website.
Once you have your permit, it is time for the main event. Getting to the top of Mount Whitney is going to take some effort. If you go the standard route, it is a 21.4 mile out and back with over 6,000 feet of elevation gain. Since the permit we have is an overnight, we're going to break it up into a couple of days. Let's go check it out. The first part of your Mount Whitney hike is very straightforward, very easy to follow, well-groomed trail, slowly working up your way, grabbing elevation, one long switchback after another. Once you start up the trail, your first turnoff, if you stay on the standard route, is going to be the Mountaineers Trail. And if you're going that route, that's the route that John Muir took when he ascended the mountain for the first time. It is its own challenge.
Now look out across. There you go.
Right before you get to Lone Pine Lake, you're gonna come to this really nice little waterfall area, and it is a perfect place to take on some fresh water if you need it, and just take a break. Nice little breeze through here. It's really enjoyable. Right after Lone Pine Lake, you're gonna reach the Whitney zone. If you don't have a permit, you are not gonna wanna go any further. After this point, you need your permit. Make sure it's signed and have it readily available if asked. Once over the pass, you drop into a meadow, and it is a nice change of pace from the long grind you just did going up past Lone Pine Lake. And you can really sort of, if you need to make up some time, this is the place to do it. Or if you want to casually stroll through like I am, this is also the place to do it. It's easy to see why John Muir felt this should be called the Range of Light. You know, you can read it and see pictures, but until you're actually walking in amongst these giant walls, you see how the sun just sort of mirrors off of them. You really can get a good understanding, like, yeah, that would be a really fitting name for this place. The Sierra Nevada really are must-visit destinations for nature lovers and adventurers. But remember, when visiting, please tread lightly, leave no trace, and take only memories, so these treasures can be enjoyed by many more in the future. as you get above tree line, you will start coming across more of hard rock and negotiating. Well, not really negotiating. The trail is still really clear, but you'll pick your way across through, and you continue to gain elevation. And surprisingly, relatively quickly after, I believe, Consultation Lake. As you near trail camp, you're going to come across Trailside Meadow, which is another great place to take on some water, take a break. It's really pretty. There is not going to be any shade, but there's definitely water, and it's definitely a nice area to take a quick break. When you reach trail camp, you'll be able to spy your next target, and it's the infamous 99 switchbacks. You'll work your way up, and once you reach the top, eventually you'll connect with the trail crest. Then you'll work your way over to Mount Whitney. Once you do get to the top of the 99 switchbacks, you are going to have an amazing view. It's stunning. You have the whole, you can almost see most of the hike before you, and you can look out and see the White Mountains across the Owens Valley. It is really cool, and you can see your final destination, Mount Whitney. Once you get above the 99 switchbacks, you'll pick up the trail crest and drop into Sequoia National Park. Then you descend a little bit and you hit the John Muir Trail and the Whitney Spur. You'll see a sign that says 1.9 miles. Follow that, you are on your final ascent to Mount Whitney. Once you've worked your way around the spires, you will continue to grind your way up until you get to the Whitney Plateau. And there's a couple more switchbacks and you'll be at the top. As you work your way across the Whitney Plateau, eventually you will break up and see the summit shelter. Let me tell you, it is a most welcome sight.
Once you reach the top, you will be rewarded with one of the best views in the state of California. The Sierras stretch out before you, and on clear days, you can see for miles. Take a moment to take it all in. You have definitely earned it.
And here we are on the summit of Mount Whitney, the rooftop of California, with an elevation of 14,505 feet. This is the second highest state high point in the USA. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment, click those like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.